And now that we have a brief but clear definition of myth and the arch-myth type, which is the combat myth or hero pattern, I'd like us to pause and consider the question of gospel genre. What type of literature is the gospel account? This has been a vexed question, and I've never seen a conclusive scholarly discussion of it. But I propose in Jesus and Myth that we can best define the genre of the gospel accounts and of the life of Jesus by comparison and contrast with the combat myth, the pattern of myth culture. And I draw on the work of Northrop Frye here to call our attention to the distinctive patterns of myth, of the combat myth, which I mentioned earlier. So let's look at the chart on the next slide, which also appears on page 15 of Jesus and Myth. Here I lay out three scholars' observations of the pattern of the combat myth and myth culture: René Girard's, Neil Forsyth's, and my own. Girard observes that, broadly speaking, the pattern of myth culture is three phases: a state of chaos in a culture or group, the scapegoating event, and the resultant cosmos or order that follows. Girard says this is a cyclical pattern, that is, human groups or cultures only maintain their cosmos, their order and peace, through repetition of scapegoating. As I said, it's a band-aid solution. Scapegoating never addresses the root cause of the chaos of humanity, only the symptoms. Scapegoating is not a cure. Neil Forsyth observes that the combat myth has 12 typical motifs that take place in a typical sequence or order of events. And as the table shows, these 12 motifs or events align with the three broader events observed by Girard. So here's practical evidence that combat myths and the behaviors of myth cultures of human groups are consistent. As Justin Martyr observed, culture imitates its gods. And finally, on the right, you can see that I've proposed 6 episodes of the pattern of myth culture that integrates the observations of both Girard and Forsyth and various other scholars as well, to provide a more descriptive terminology, I hope, for the events and their meanings in the pattern of myth culture that will facilitate our goal of this course and this book, which is to answer the question once and for all: is Jesus mythological? Are the gospel accounts mythological? And as I said, we'll be able to answer this question by testing the gospel accounts to see if Jesus Christ conforms to this pattern of myth culture, laid out in this table, or not. So here's a fourth discussion question for us. As we consider defining gospel genre in relation to this pattern of myth culture, do you think Jesus' life pattern recorded in the Gospels conforms to this pattern? Why or why not? Another consideration I introduce at this point in the book to help us think about the relationship between Jesus and myth is a well-known feature of biblical accounts from the Old Testament, which is called the reflection story. From the very beginning of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, we can readily observe the uniqueness of Scripture, how Genesis and the Bible as a whole are distinct from man-made myths of origins and everything else. The biblical account of the creation of this universe is absolutely unique, as is the Creator God that performed that work as recorded there. There are certain other accounts in Genesis, I think particularly of the account of Abraham and the account of Joseph, his great-grandson, that have been compared and contrasted with seemingly similar ancient myths and found to be diametrically opposed in their meanings. The Abraham account has been called a reflection story in relation to the ancient Near Eastern myth of child sacrifice by scholars Yair Zakovich and Omri Baim. That is, the two accounts, the one of Abraham's preservation of his child's life versus myth sacrifice of the child that was typical of ancient Canaan in which Abraham lived, are like mirror reflections of one another. Abraham's life is an inversion in sequence and a subversion in significance of myth, the pattern of myth culture with its scapegoating of children. The Bible is typically inversive and subversive in relation to myth. So now, thinking about this in terms of Jesus' life in the gospel accounts, as David Cayley said in summary of René Girard's work on the gospel accounts, the gospels are a redemptive return to the pattern of myth as well as its overcoming. What this means, as we'll discover as we continue this study, is that the gospel account contains the pattern of myth culture, but myth's pattern is systematically inverted and subverted by Jesus. And so there are two patterns in the gospel accounts: Jesus' unique biblical pattern and the ubiquitous pattern of myth culture lived out by everyone else recorded in the gospel accounts. And I've coined a term for the relationship between these two patterns, which is the chiastic bipattern. That is, conceptually, Jesus' pattern crisscrosses the pattern of myth, inverting it and subverting it, as they both unfold simultaneously throughout the account. And so I've proposed that the genre of the Gospel account is best defined as the genre of biblical chiasm.